Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Let the day's worries melt away as the stillness of the night surrounds you. Imagine yourself standing at the base of the silent peaks, where the air is crisp and the mountains rise like guardians of ancient secrets. Tonight, we journey to a place untouched by time, where whispers echo through the winds, and an ancient dragon watches from the shadows. As the story unfolds, let its quiet rhythm carry you to a place of peace, where dreams take flight among the stars. Relax, breathe deeply, and allow the soft cadence of my voice to guide you into a restful sleep. The silent peaks await, and with them, a tale of mystery and wonder. Let the story begin. The silent peaks rose like jagged teeth against the sky, their snow-capped summits cutting through the clouds in stillness. No birds flew there. No animals roamed their slopes. It was a place untouched by life, where the wind moved in whispered tones, and the air felt heavier with each step closer to its forbidden heights. The villagers at the base of the mountains knew better than to venture far. Stories were told in hushed voices, usually by fireside, about the ancient creature that dwelled within the peaks. It was said that the dragon had made its home there long before any of the villages had existed, long before anyone could remember. Though no one alive had ever seen it, the legends persisted like a quiet echo in the minds of those who lived in its shadow. They called it the Whispering Dragon, for it was said that its voice could be heard in the winds that whipped through the mountain passes, faint as a breath, carrying with it the secrets of the ages. But none who heard the dragon's whisper were ever the same. The stories told of wise men and adventurers, drawn by the promise of knowledge only the dragon could give. They had climbed the peaks in search of the beast, seeking answers to questions no mortal should ever ask. And they had returned broken, if they returned at all. Madness clung to them, like fog to the mountains. They spoke of strange visions, of voices that never left their heads, of truths too vast to comprehend. Those who survived became outcasts, muttering to themselves in forgotten corners of the village, haunted by the dragon's whisper. From her window, Lena could see the mountains. They had always intrigued her, standing so silent and still, as if guarding something ancient and unknowable. She had heard the stories, like everyone else, but they did not frighten her. If anything, they fascinated her. There was something about the mystery of the silent peaks that called to her, like a song barely audible but impossible to ignore. She had always been different from the others in the village, restless, curious, unafraid of the unknown. Where others saw danger, she saw possibility. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the village, Lena's thoughts turned once again to the stories of the dragon. It was said that his whisper could grant immense knowledge, truths about the world, the stars, even life and death itself. But that knowledge came at a price. Madness, they said. The human mind was not meant to hold such wisdom, and those who sought it would be consumed by it. Yet Lena wondered, what if there was a way to seek the dragon's knowledge without falling to madness? What if she could find the dragon and hear its whisper and return with her mind intact? It was a dangerous thought, but once it took root in her, it was impossible to shake. She had heard the old man's mutterings, the strange tales he spun by the fire. Eldrin had once been a scholar, one who had sought knowledge in the mountains and returned with something broken. The villagers feared him, avoided him, but Lena had listened. In his fragmented words, she heard something others did not. A glimpse of something far greater than the madness that had taken hold of him. The dragon's whisper had not driven him entirely mad. He still spoke of things that no one else knew, truths that seemed too strange to be imagined. Perhaps there was a way to control the madness, to channel the knowledge. The village, nestled in the valley, grew quiet as night fell. But the mountains, those peaks of stone and silence, loomed over them, watching. Lena stood at her window, staring at the distant heights. A whisper, soft and almost imperceptible, seemed to brush against her ear, though she was miles away. Perhaps it was only the wind, but in that moment, she knew she would go. The silent peaks were calling her, and she would answer. Tomorrow, she would set out. The dragon's whisper awaited her, and she would discover if its secrets could truly be tamed, or if the price was too high to pay. The first step toward madness was always taken in silence. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the inn, casting flickering shadows on the rough stone walls. In the farthest corner, where the light barely reached, Eldrin sat alone, muttering to himself as he often did. The other villagers had long since learned to ignore him, dismissing his ramblings as the ravings of a madman. But to Lena, there was a strange sense to his madness, a pattern hidden in the words that no one else seemed to hear. On this night she approached him, her heart thrumming with an odd mixture of fear and anticipation. She had often listened from a distance, but tonight she needed to know more. If anyone could tell her the truth about the dragon's whisper, it was Eldrin. After all, he had heard it, and he had lived to tell the tale, if only in fragments. Eldrin, she whispered, as she sat down across from him, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. He didn't look up. His gaze was fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the inn, as if he was staring into the depths of his own memories. Trapped there. Tell me about the dragon. At the word dragon, Eldrin's eyes flickered with the faintest trace of awareness, but his voice remained low, muttering phrases that made little sense. The mountains, they speak, always speak. The wind is never still. His voice trembled, each word carrying the weight of a memory he could never escape. Lena leaned closer, her voice firmer now. The whisper. What did you hear? For a moment, there was only silence. Then Eldrin's eyes met hers. And in that instant, Lena saw something that both terrified and intrigued her. Knowledge. Deep, unfathomable knowledge that shimmered just beneath the surface of his madness. He opened his mouth to speak, and his voice came out in a hoarse whisper, as though the very act of recalling the memory pained him. "It is not a sound," he said, his voice rasping like the wind through dead leaves. "It is a presence, a voice that is not a voice. It fills your mind, wraps around your thoughts like a snake. At first it is gentle, like the touch of a breeze. But then it sinks deeper, and you feel it. Truth, knowledge, everything the world has hidden. You see it all, and it is too much." His hands trembled as he spoke, and Lena felt a chill crawl down her spine. "What did it show you?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. Eldrin's eyes darkened, his face twisting with a mix of wonder and fear. "Everything," he whispered. "I saw the stars being born, and the light of the first dawn. I saw the bones of the earth and the secrets of the deep, and I saw what lies beyond what any mortal should ever know." Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had always been drawn to the unknown, to the secrets hidden just beyond the veil of understanding. But this was something else, something far greater than she had imagined. She leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "But you survived. You came back." Eldrin laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "Survived? No, child, I returned. But I did not come back whole." He lifted a trembling hand to his temple, tapping it lightly as if to emphasize the fracture. "The knowledge, it shatters you. It takes your mind and pulls it apart, piece by piece, until you are left with fragments. Pieces of a puzzle that will never fit together again." Lena swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her. But still, she could not shake the pull, the allure of the whisper, of the knowledge it promised. "Is there no way to control it?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "To take the knowledge without losing yourself?" Eldrin's eyes glinted with something that might have been pity or perhaps regret. "There are those who believe they can," he said softly. "Many have tried, but the dragon's whisper is not meant for mortal minds. It is ancient, older than time itself, and those who seek it, they must be prepared to pay the price." Lena sat back, her mind racing. She had known the risks. Everyone in the village knew the stories. But hearing it from Eldrin, seeing the madness in his eyes, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Yet the pull was stronger now. The desire to know, to see what lay beyond the limits of human understanding. "Thank you," she whispered, rising to her feet. Eldrin said nothing more, his gaze drifting back to the fire, lost once again in his endless spiral of thoughts. As Lena stepped out into the cold night air, the mountains loomed in the distance, dark and silent. But now, in the stillness, she could almost hear it, the faintest whisper carried on the wind, calling her. And she knew, without a doubt, that she would go. The dragon's whisper awaited her, and she could not turn back. The morning arrived veiled in mist, the sun little more than a pale suggestion behind the shroud of clouds that lingered over the silent peaks. Lena stood at the edge of the village, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains that loomed in the north. The path she was about to take stretched out before her like a dark ribbon, winding through the dense forests at the foot of the peaks and disappearing into the shadow of the mountains themselves. There was no fanfare, no farewell. The village had long since grown indifferent to the fate of those who set their sights on the whispering dragon. Once, many years ago, there might have been warnings, pleas to turn back, to reconsider. But too many had tried, and too many had never returned. Now, Lena's departure was met with silence, as if the village had already forgotten her before she had even gone. Her footsteps were soft against the dirt path, the sound swallowed by the mist that clung to the ground. She carried little with her, only what she thought she might need for the journey. A small pack with food and water, a cloak to ward off the cold that would surely grow harsher as she climbed higher, and a thin blade strapped to her side, more for comfort than protection. What use was a weapon against a whisper? The forest that bordered the village was familiar to her, but as she ventured deeper, it took on a different shape. The trees stood taller here, their branches weaving together in a thick canopy that blocked out the sky. The air was still, unnaturally so, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Lena felt the weight of it pressing down on her, an eerie quiet that grew heavier the farther she walked. Even the animals seemed to avoid this place. The only sound was the faint crunch of her boots on the leaf-strewn path, and the occasional rustle of unseen things moving just beyond her sight. Hours passed in this silence, the path winding ever upward. As the day stretched on, the mist began to clear, revealing the jagged peaks of the mountains ahead. Lena paused at a bend in the path, gazing up at the towering cliffs that now seemed much closer, their dark, rocky faces disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. Somewhere up there, the dragon waited. The stories had all been vague, deliberately so, she suspected, about where the dragon actually resided. Some said it lived deep in the heart of the mountain, within caverns carved from the bones of the earth itself. Others believed it perched on the highest peak, where the air grew too thin to breathe and the sky turned black. Wherever it was, Lena knew she would find it, or it would find her. The whisper would guide her, as it had guided those before her. As she continued her ascent, the landscape changed. The trees thinned, giving way to rocky outcrops and steep inclines. The air grew colder, biting at her cheeks and forcing her to pull her cloak tighter around her shoulders. The silence became more oppressive, the mountains themselves seeming to hum with a presence just beyond her understanding. It was as if the very stones were watching her, waiting. Lena's mind began to wander, her thoughts slipping into the rhythm of her footsteps. She thought of Eldrin and his fractured mind, of the broken pieces of knowledge that had consumed him. Was she truly prepared for what awaited her? Could she resist the madness that had claimed so many before her? A whisper of doubt flickered in her mind, but she pushed it aside. She had come too far to turn back now. The first signs of twilight began to creep across the sky, casting long shadows over the path as Lena reached a small clearing. She decided to rest here for the night, her body weary from the climb. As she sat by the small fire she had managed to start, her gaze drifted up to the peaks that towered above her. In the fading light, the mountains seemed alive, shifting and changing in ways that defied explanation. And then she heard it. A faint sound, carried on the wind. A whisper, just beyond the edge of hearing. It was so soft that she could have dismissed it as nothing more than the breeze stirring the trees. But Lena knew better. Her heart quickened, and she closed her eyes, straining to catch the sound again. There it was, a voice without words, a presence that brushed against her mind like the touch of a distant memory. The dragon's whisper. It was nothing like she had imagined, and yet it was exactly as she had feared. There was something in the sound that called to her, a deep and ancient knowledge that tugged at the edges of her thoughts. For a moment, she felt the pull of it, the urge to follow the whisper deeper into the mountains, to let it guide her. But then the sound faded, leaving behind only the silence of the night. Lena opened her eyes, her pulse racing. She was close now. The whisper had found her, and soon she would find the dragon. The night pressed down like a heavy curtain, thick and impenetrable. The fire had dwindled to a few glowing embers, casting faint flickers of light that barely reached beyond the edges of Lena's camp. She sat in the darkness, the world around her eerily still. The whisper she had heard earlier had been faint, so faint that she might have convinced herself it was her imagination. But deep down, she knew it had been real. The dragon's presence was near, closer than she had anticipated. The air was colder now, carrying a biting chill that seemed to seep into her bones. Lena wrapped her cloak tighter around herself and stared into the remnants of the fire, her mind spinning with the possibilities of what lay ahead. She could still feel the whisper, a presence lingering just out of reach, like a shadow at the edge of her consciousness. It was not a voice, not in the way one might expect. It was more like a thought that wasn't her own, a thread of ancient knowledge weaving itself into the fabric of her mind, drawing her deeper into its web. Sleep did not come easily that night. When it did, it was filled with strange, fragmented dreams. Visions of endless skies, ancient stones, carved with forgotten symbols, and a presence that watched her from the shadows, unseen but unmistakable. She awoke several times, the whisper still echoing faintly in her ears. Each time it seemed closer, more insistent. As dawn approached, the sky began to lighten, though the sun remained hidden behind a thick veil of clouds. Lena extinguished the last of the embers and shouldered her pack, ready to continue her ascent. The path ahead was steep and treacherous, winding through jagged rocks and narrow ledges that seemed to cling precariously to the mountain's face. The air was thinner now, every breath a reminder of the heights she was reaching. It was midday when she heard it again. The whisper. This time it was clearer, unmistakable. It was no longer a faint murmur carried on the wind, but a soft melodic hum that seemed to resonate from the very stones beneath her feet. Lena froze, her heart pounding. The whisper grew louder, filling the air around her, though there was no source, no voice to be seen. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A sound that was not a sound, wrapping around her mind like tendrils of mist. She closed her eyes, letting the whisper wash over her. It was gentle at first, almost soothing, like the soft rustle of leaves in a distant forest. But as it filled her thoughts, it began to shift. The hum deepened, twisting into something darker, something that pulsed with a knowledge far beyond her understanding. Lena's head throbbed, and she could feel the weight of the dragon's wisdom pressing against her mind, pushing her toward the edge of something vast and unknowable. And then came the first vision. It flickered in her mind's eye, like a reflection in a rippling pool of water, blurry, fragmented, but undeniably real. She saw a vast expanse of stars, spinning in the blackness of the night sky, their light flickering like dying embers. And beyond the stars, something ancient stirred, something that had existed long before time had meaning. It was as if the dragon's whisper was pulling back the veil on the universe itself, showing her things that no mortal was meant to see. The vision shifted, and suddenly Lena was standing at the edge of a great chasm, its depths stretching into an abyss that seemed to go on forever. The whisper was louder now, a chorus of voices that echoed from the chasm, each one promising knowledge, power, and understanding. But as she peered into the abyss, she felt a creeping dread, a warning that whatever lay at the bottom of that chasm could consume her completely. Lena gasped, her eyes snapping open as the vision faded. The whisper was gone, leaving her standing on the narrow mountain path, her heart racing and her mind spinning with the echoes of what she had just seen. The knowledge the dragon offered was vast, yes, but it was also dangerous. She could feel it now, the pull of it, the way it beckoned her to keep going, to listen more closely, to seek the truth that lay hidden within the dragon's whisper. But even in that moment, Lena understood what Eldrin had meant. The knowledge was seductive, but it was also a trap. The deeper she ventured into the dragon's realm, the more she risked losing herself. Still, there was no turning back. The whisper had marked her now, and its echo would haunt her until she found its source. Lena steadied herself, breathing deeply as she resumed her climb. The mountains loomed ever higher, and somewhere within their shadowed peaks, the dragon waited. And so did the truth. The first echo had reached her. Now, it was only a matter of time before she heard the full whisper. The world around Lena began to distort as she ventured deeper into the heart of the mountains. The air itself felt heavier, pressing down upon her with an invisible force. The higher she climbed, the more the landscape shifted. At first, it was subtle. The rocks seemed to move when she wasn't looking. The shadows stretched in ways they shouldn't. But soon, it became undeniable. The mountains were not merely stone and earth. They were alive, pulsing with an energy that warped reality. The path beneath her feet twisted unnaturally, curving at impossible angles, leading her in circles even though she was certain she had been walking straight. The whisper had returned, but now it was constant. A low hum that vibrated in her skull, always on the edge of hearing. It filled her thoughts with fragments of knowledge, bits and pieces of something larger, something incomprehensible. Each new fragment felt like a puzzle piece, and Lena could feel the urge to fit them together, to make sense of the vast cryptic truth the dragon's whisper promised. But the more she tried to grasp it, the more it slipped away. Time had lost all meaning. Days and nights blurred together, indistinguishable in the thin mountain air. The sun, when it appeared at all, seemed dimmer, as if its light could not reach the peaks. Lena pressed on, driven by a strange compulsion that she could no longer resist. She could feel the whisper pulling her towards something, a destination she could not yet see but felt in her bones. Her mind began to play tricks on her. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught glimpses of figures moving in the distance, shadowy forms that disappeared when she turned her head. Once, she saw a figure standing on a ridge high above her, watching her with eyes that glinted like fire. But when she blinked, it was gone. She could hear voices now, not just the whisper of the dragon, but other voices, murmurs in the wind, disembodied and distant, as though the very mountains were speaking to her. And then came the visions. They struck her without warning, like flashes of lightning in a dark sky. She would be walking, and suddenly the ground beneath her would vanish, replaced by something else. Endless oceans, cities of gleaming stone, ancient forests stretching as far as the eye could see. Each vision was more vivid than the last, and each one left her disoriented, unsure of where or even when she was. The whisper grew louder in these moments, filling her mind with images and thoughts that weren't her own. In one vision, she stood on a mountain much like the one she was climbing. But it was not the silent peaks. It was older, darker, and in the distance she saw a figure, a man, his face hidden beneath a hood. He stood at the edge of a great abyss, and from that abyss came the same whisper that now echoed in Lena's mind. The man turned toward her, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light, and in that moment she knew. He had heard the whisper, just as she had, but he had been consumed by it. Lena gasped, stumbling back as the vision shattered, and she found herself once again on the narrow, rocky path. Her heart raced, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The line between reality and the visions was beginning to blur. The whisper was no longer a distant hum. It was inside her now, threading through her thoughts, twisting her perception. She could feel it pushing her toward the edge, daring her to fall. For the first time, she understood the madness Eldrin had spoken of. The knowledge the dragon offered was not something that could be grasped by a mortal mind. It was too vast, too ancient, too filled with truths that defied reason. And yet, the more it unraveled in her mind, the more Lena wanted to know. She could feel herself teetering on the brink of understanding, just one step away from seeing the full picture. But with that knowledge came the madness that whispered in her ear, urging her to listen. Still, she could not stop. She had come too far, and now she could feel it. The dragon's presence, closer than ever. Her body moved as if guided by an unseen hand, her feet carrying her forward, even as her mind spun in circles. The path twisted upward, steeper and more treacherous. But she did not falter. She was no longer walking through the mountains. She was walking through the dragon's domain, a place where time and reality had no meaning. The whisper grew louder, filling the air surrounding her. It was no longer a voice. It was a force, a presence that pulsed with ancient power. Lena's vision blurred, her thoughts fracturing like shards of glass. She could feel her mind slipping, unraveling under the weight of the knowledge the dragon had given her. But she pushed forward, her body trembling with the effort. She was close now, so close, and the dragon was waiting. The mountain path opened into a vast plateau, barren and cold, with jagged rocks stretching toward the horizon like the broken bones of an ancient giant. Above, the sky churned with dark clouds, swirling as though they too were under the dragon's spell. The air was thin, and each breath Lena took felt like it was being pulled from her lungs by invisible hands. She had reached the summit. Before her, at the far edge of the plateau, was a cave. Its mouth yawned wide, a dark and jagged opening that seemed to breathe in time with the mountain. From within, the whisper called to her, not in the distant, ethereal way it had before, but clearly as though the dragon itself was speaking directly into her mind. The sound was soft, like the stirring of leaves in a forgotten forest, but underneath that softness was something far more ancient, something vast, timeless, and filled with power beyond her understanding. Lena stood at the entrance, staring into the depths of the cave. It was darker than any night she had ever known, and though she could not see beyond a few feet, she could feel the presence of the dragon inside. It was waiting for her, as it had waited for countless others before her. She could feel its eyes, though they were still hidden in the shadows, watching her, measuring her, and weighing the worth of her soul against the knowledge she sought. She stepped forward, the sound of her boots against the stone floor echoing in the silence. The air inside the cave was thick, oppressive, and cold, but there was something else here, something ancient and alive. The whisper grew louder with each step she took, filling the air, filling her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like a living thing. It was no longer a faint murmur. It was a voice, clear and resonant, though it still spoke no words. Instead, it carried images, fragments of memory and truth that seemed to flicker in and out of existence just beyond her reach. The cave twisted downward, spiraling into the depths of the mountain. As Lena descended, the walls around her seemed to shift and pulse, like the inside of a great living beast. She could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down upon her, the cold stone pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm that matched the beat of her own heart. The whisper was all around her now, filling every corner of her mind, tugging at the edges of her thoughts. And then she saw them, two glowing orbs of light floating in the darkness ahead, watching her with an intensity that froze her where she stood. They were not like the eyes of any creature she had ever seen. They were vast, deep, and filled with an intelligence so ancient that it felt like staring into the heart of the universe itself. The dragon's eyes. They gleamed with a cold, otherworldly light, illuminating nothing but the shadows around them. The dragon did not move. It did not need to. Its presence filled the cave, filled the very air she breathed. And the whisper was no longer just a sound. It was a force, pressing against her thoughts, unraveling the last threads of her sanity. The dragon's gaze pierced through her, as if it could see not just her body, but the very essence of her soul. Lena's knees buckled under the weight of its presence, and she fell to the ground, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She could feel the knowledge, the impossible, endless knowledge pouring into her mind. It was too much, far too much. Visions flooded her consciousness, faster than she could process them. She saw the creation of worlds, stars igniting in the cold void of space, and the bones of ancient creatures long since turned to dust. She saw cities rise and fall, civilizations swallowed by time. She saw the faces of people she had never met, heard their thoughts, their secrets, their fears. The dragon's whisper filled her mind with truths too vast for any mortal to contain. Lena's thoughts fractured, splintering under the weight of it all. She could feel the madness creeping in, just as Eldrin had warned. The knowledge was unraveling her, tearing her apart from the inside. But still, she reached for it, desperate to understand, to grasp the full picture, to see what the dragon saw. The dragon's eyes burned brighter, as if it were waiting for something, for her to make a choice. And in that moment, Lena realized what the dragon had been waiting for all along. The knowledge was not something that could be given freely. It had to be taken. But to take it would mean losing herself completely, surrendering to the madness, letting the whisper consume her until she became nothing more than a hollow shell. She stared into the dragon's eyes, trembling, her mind on the edge of collapse. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, beckoning her to take the final step. But Lena held back. For a fleeting moment, she saw the truth, the real truth behind the dragon's whisper. It was not meant for mortals. The knowledge it carried was beyond the capacity of any human mind, and those who sought it would always be destroyed by it. The dragon's whisper was a test, a lure, a trap for those who dared to seek what should never be found. Lena took a shuddering breath, her vision blurred with tears, her body trembling with exhaustion. The dragon's eyes bore into her, waiting for her to choose. And she knew then what she had to do. With one final trembling breath, she closed her eyes and turned away from the dragon's gaze. The whisper fell silent. The dragon's eyes dimmed, and the cave was still once more. Lena staggered to her feet, her body weak but her mind intact. She had not taken the knowledge. She had not succumbed to the madness, and in that choice, she had saved herself from becoming another of the mountain's broken souls. But the dragon's whisper would never leave her. It was a part of her now, a shadow that would follow her for the rest of her life. The mountain was silent as Lena emerged from the cave, the weight of her choice heavy on her shoulders. The dragon had let her go, but she knew deep down that she had only seen the first glimpse of what lay beyond the whisper. The world outside the cave felt like a distant echo of the one Lena had left behind. The mountain still loomed, silent and imposing, but something had shifted. The air felt thinner, the sky a shade darker, and the whisper, though no longer filling her mind, lingered in the shadows of her thoughts. It was as if the mountains themselves had absorbed the weight of her experience, reflecting it back in the stark stillness of the peaks. Lena stood on the plateau, the wind tugging at her cloak, her mind reeling from what she had just faced. The dragon's eyes, burning with the wisdom far beyond her grasp, still haunted her vision. She had felt the pull of its knowledge, the way it beckoned her to give in, to let it consume her, and she had almost allowed it, but she had chosen to turn away. Her legs trembled beneath her, the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones. The climb, the whispers, the visions. It had all brought her to the edge of something vast and unknowable. And now, in the silence, she felt both the loss and relief of having denied that final step. The sky above her shifted, the clouds swirling slowly, as though they too were part of the ancient magic that surrounded the mountains. The dragon's presence had receded, but it had not vanished entirely. She could feel it watching her still, waiting. It had given her the choice to take the knowledge, but what she had not understood before became clear now. It had never truly been about gaining wisdom. It had been about the price. Wisdom came with sacrifice. Lena gazed out over the jagged landscape that stretched beyond the plateau. The world looked different now, tinged with a subtle darkness that hadn't been there before. She had glimpsed something vast in the dragon's whisper, something that touched every part of existence. The visions that had flooded her mind in the cave were fragments of a greater truth, a truth too dangerous for any human to fully understand. But even as she had chosen to step away from that final madness, a part of her had wanted to know more. The lure of the dragon's knowledge was like a shadow, following her, whispering still in the deep corners of her mind. Had she truly resisted, or had she only delayed the inevitable? Could anyone who heard the whisper ever escape its grip? She looked down at her hands, half expecting to see something different, some mark of the dragon's presence upon her skin. But her hands were the same as they had always been, trembling slightly with the cold and the exhaustion that now gripped her body. And yet, something had changed. The choice she had made had left an imprint on her soul, something deeper, something that could not be seen or touched. A soft sound reached her ears, carried on the wind like a distant sigh. It was not the dragon's whisper, not the voice that had haunted her throughout her journey. It was something else, faint, fragile. The wind itself, perhaps, or the mountains murmuring in their ancient language. But it felt like more than that. A subtle echo of the choice she had made. Lena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her like a heavy cloak. She had come here seeking the dragon's wisdom, believing that she could grasp it without falling into madness. But what she had discovered was far more complex than she had ever imagined. The knowledge the dragon offered was not just about the world. It was about the self. It was about understanding the limits of human consciousness, the line between wisdom and madness, and the danger of crossing it. She had stood on the edge of that abyss, and she had chosen to turn back. In doing so, she had gained something far more valuable than the fragmented truths the dragon had whispered into her mind. She had gained the understanding that some knowledge was not meant to be held. That wisdom often lay in knowing what to leave behind. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the plateau, the sky bleeding into hues of crimson and gold. Lena watched as the light faded, feeling the chill of the coming night. She had survived the dragon's whisper, but she knew that her journey was far from over. The mountain had let her go, but the echo of its presence would follow her always. In the growing darkness, she took a deep breath and turned away from the cave, her footsteps carrying her down the narrow path that led back to the world below. She did not look back, but the weight of the dragon's gaze remained with her, a reminder of the choice she had made and the knowledge she had left behind. As she descended into the twilight, Lena realized that the real journey had only just begun. The world she returned to was the same, yet different. And though she had chosen to leave the dragon's wisdom behind, she carried with her a deeper understanding. Sometimes, the greatest wisdom was in knowing when to walk away. The whisper might have fallen silent, but its echo would remain. And with that echo, she would live. Lena's descent from the silent peaks was not the triumphant return she had imagined. The world she stepped back into felt distant, like a memory she could no longer fully grasp. The village at the foot of the mountains remained unchanged. The same stone cottages, the same paths winding through the trees. Yet to her, everything seemed veiled in a faint shadow, as if the air itself had shifted, thickened with the weight of what she had left behind. She moved through the streets in silence, the familiar sights and sounds barely registering in her mind. The villagers cast curious glances her way, but none dared approach. They knew where she had been. They had seen others make the same journey, though most never returned. Those who did were never quite the same. Lena found herself standing outside Eldrin's small weathered home, its thatched roof sagging under the weight of time. The old man sat in his usual place by the fire, muttering softly to himself, his eyes clouded with the remnants of the knowledge he had once sought. For a moment, Lena hesitated. She had returned, but was she any different from him now? Had she truly escaped the madness, or was it only a matter of time before the whisper took root in her mind as it had with him? Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. Eldrin's gaze lifted slowly as she entered, his expression blank at first, as if it took him a moment to recognize her. But when he did, something flickered in his eyes. A brief spark of awareness, perhaps even understanding. He said nothing, only watched her with a quiet intensity, as though he already knew the answer to the question she had come to ask. Lena sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. For a long time, they sat in silence, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire and the faint whisper of the wind outside. Finally she spoke, her voice low and uncertain. "I heard it, Eldrin. The whisper." The old man's eyes narrowed slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. He nodded once, as if to say, "Of course you did." Lena looked down at her hands, her mind turning over the events of the past days. The journey, the whisper, the visions. The dragon's eyes watching her in the darkness. And the choice she had made. "I didn't take it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I walked away." For the first time, Eldrin's expression changed. His brow furrowed, and something like disbelief crossed his face. "You walked away?" His voice was hoarse, broken from years of disuse, but beneath the rasp, there was a note of astonishment. Lena nodded, meeting his gaze. I could feel it, the knowledge, the power. It was there, right in front of me. But I realized it wasn't meant for us. The price was too high. Eldrin stared at her for a long moment, his expression shifting from disbelief to something deeper, something that bordered on awe. "You're the first," he murmured, almost to himself. "The first to come back whole." Lena's heart twisted at his words. Was she whole? She wasn't sure. The whisper still echoed faintly in the back of her mind, a constant hum just below the surface of her thoughts. It had followed her down the mountain, lingering like a shadow she couldn't shake. She had turned away from the madness, but the knowledge she had glimpsed had left its mark. "Will it ever stop?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with the uncertainty that had haunted her since her return. The echo. Will it ever fade? Eldrin's gaze softened, a trace of sadness in his eyes. "No," he said, his voice gentle. "It will always be with you. Once you've heard the whisper, it never truly leaves. But you chose to walk away. That is what makes you different. You chose not to let it consume you." Lena felt a heavy weight settle in her chest. She had made the right choice. She knew that. But the knowledge, the fragments of truth she had glimpsed, still lingered. The vision still haunted her dreams, and the dragon's gaze still burned in her mind. The whisper might never leave her, but she had learned to live with it. She had learned to carry the echo without letting it tear her apart. As she stood to leave, Eldrin's voice stopped her. "Lena," he said, his eyes filled with a kind of quiet reverence. "You are stronger than any of us who came before. Remember that." Lena nodded, though the weight of his words felt heavier than she expected. She stepped outside, the cold mountain air biting at her skin. The village lay before her, bathed in the pale light of the fading afternoon. Life went on as it always had, unchanged by the ancient forces that lingered in the mountains above. But Lena had changed. As she walked through the village, the whisper hummed softly in her ears, a constant reminder of what she had seen. what she had chosen to leave behind. It was no longer the same seductive call it had been on the mountain. It was quieter now, more distant, an echo that she could live with. The silent peaks loomed in the distance, their jagged forms disappearing into the clouds. Somewhere, deep within the mountain, the dragon still waited, its whisper reaching out to those who dared seek its knowledge. But Lena knew now that not all knowledge was meant to be held, and not all wisdom came from knowing. Sometimes the greatest wisdom lay in choosing to let go. The echo would never end, but Lena had learned to live with it. And as she walked away from the mountains, she knew that in the end, that was enough.